do folks remember this graph? I did this kind of drawing last time, and I did two things like this. Do you remember this? Kind of like this. Actually, the purple one wasn't quite like that at the bottom. You remember that? Purple one kind of went like this. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So this was a kind of a timeline, if you will, right? And you can put Carnap's 1932 paper over here, right? Let's say. So this is 1932, and you can say let's write that over here. 1932. Of course, this has to get translated, but it makes waves, and the whole general idea gets conveyed. If you want some backstory, Carnap made it to the English-speaking world primarily because of a guy named Alfred Jules Ayer, so A.J. Ayer, who wrote a book called Truth, Language, and Logic, which was small and extremely well written, where A.J. Ayer conveyed. And I believe it was published in 1936. So by 1936, definitely the English-speaking world had access to a very clear and charitable presentation of the views of the Vienna Circle that included Rudolf Carnap. And that basically one of the tenets of the positions that were developed by the Vienna Circle was this kind of rejection of metaphysics, and not just kind of like just cause, right? Like principled demolition job, right? And so the purple line is activity in metaphysics. And after these ideas kind of get into the metaphysical, the philosophical conversation, there's a sharp decline, like a really noticeable. And again, we could defend this by looking at the work that's been done in journals, a huge decline in the work that's been done in metaphysics, and at the same time, a sharp rise in the work that's done in philosophical analysis. Because you remember the paper that we saw just gets reduced to the analysis of language. Yeah, metaphysics gets reduced to conversations just about semantics. Exactly, that's exactly right. What's left for philosophy, Carnap says at the end. So what's philosophy? If philosophy is not nonsense, and it's not analytic statements that are tautologies, that are purely logical, and it's not the empirical claims of science, what, according to, tell me in your own words, what according to Carnap is left of philosophy? That's not going to be the three possibilities. It's not going to be nonsense, it's not going to be science, and it's not going to be logic. So what's left for philosophy? It's a method. It's a method of logical analysis. You've got it, right? It's a method of logical analysis that aims to discover pseudo statements and tells, like Sumdish writes, Art, it tells people who try to do metaphysics, tut, 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 you should be doing some art instead. Like what you're actually doing is you're expressing your love, your worldview in a kind of emotional sense and dressing it up in theory, but really you're not actually doing it. You know, you're not doing the right thing. It's a kind of a perversion of what it means, because a theory is something that can be disproven. So if you think about Karl Popper, who, by the way, was an Austrian, so he's in the orbit of the Vienna Circle, but was always an outsider. Karl Popper, arguably, I would argue, sort of the greatest philosopher of science of the 20th century, said that the distinctive feature of science is that it's falsifiable. It opens itself up to the possibility of being shown false. Metaphysics is not falsifiable. Like there's nothing you can do, you know, in metaphysics to show a metaphysical view wrong. Now, one of the things I have to warn you about, is all of the things that we did in metaphysics, so the textbook that we read, everything that we did in the first, like, you know, when we did material objects, ontology, and persistence is post-reform, so over here, right? So all of the stuff that we did, because you can imagine, let me put X over here and let me put Y over here. X is metaphysics in the good old days. Actually, my Y starts to look a lot like an X. Let me put a nice clean Y. There you go. X over here, that's metaphysics in the good old days. Right? And metaphysics in the good old days is lavish. It's completely, by today's lights, you would think over the top, like grand speculation about like a God mind, sort of, you know, structuring and all this kind of, like, it's heavy duty, right? You get Meinong's in the mix, exactly, right? So the square circle is as square as it is circular, and the Golden Mountain subsists, and all this kind of, like, it's wild. And by today's standards, you would think it's almost silly. And also, if you look at the entire history of philosophy, because this timeline here goes back. Remember, we said all the way to Thales, so it goes all the way back to saying like everything is made of water, right? Or in Pythagoras' case, everything is made of numbers. The only thing that exists are numbers. Or ratios, hence the rationalism. Right? Rationalism takes its root in this. It's grandiose, right? What we studied in metaphysics, and this might give you kind of a distorted view of metaphysics historically, is over here where I say why. This is post-Carnap, it's reformed metaphysics. It's metaphysics that's mindful that it needs to proceed far, far more carefully, and to really, really ease back on the speculative, grandiose claims. So you've studied this over here, right? But I don't think that you may have been exposed to the X sort of metaphysics, but in your history of philosophy classes. So when you were doing Descartes, when you're doing the pre-Socratics, when you're doing Plato, when you're doing Thomas Aquinas, that's good old-fashioned metaphysics prior to Carnap's 1932 critique. What we studied, you can tell, is much more rigorous and much more scientifically inclined and also much more cautious. So we're walking on eggshells when we're doing metaphysics in the text that I read you, that we did as a kind of a starter kit. Is that clear, everyone? Just to give you a kind of a corrective here, right? We were learning the metaphysics after Carnap. So already Papa Carnap scared everyone and we all started cleaning up our act much more. So this is the post-renewal, right? So after this uptick here, this curve. And the thing is, so if you want to ask why is this kind of, there's an uptick, the two figures, if you want to give some names to this, that sort of that sort of tell, kind of convince folks in philosophy that metaphysics is legit again, are Quine, and you could argue David Lewis. So David Lewis and Quine, especially Quine, made it safe to do metaphysics again because they kind of boldly started doing metaphysics, but in a different way, and that inspired, metaphysical work again. And the metaphysical work, and by the way, David Lewis, yesterday I started watching Doctor Strange Into the Multiverse of Madness. If he's the guy responsible for all this multiverse nonsense. So Marvel Comics and DC Comics and everyone basically who's at Hollywood bored and wants to make stories, they're all plagiarizing David Lewis. In the 1980s, he wrote a book on the plurality of worlds, and he makes these technical arguments for why we should start thinking about possibility as existing in another possible world. And so these folks were doing metaphysics, but with really serious logic. So one thing that's common to both Quine and David Lewis is that they're both really good at logic, and they're not grounding their metaphysical views in sort of poetry, right? Is it related to quantum physics? Kind of, yeah, Chris. So if we did the second-year metaphysics course, we'd spend a week on it, and you see the similarities and differences. So there are some similarities, but there's some differences. The philosopher gets to possible worlds. The physicist gets to multiverse. The definition of a possible world in philosophy would mean that if America Chavez can get to another world, you're still in your same world. So possible worlds have no causal or information transfer among one another. So everything that happens in the movie I'm currently watching, which I haven't finished, right, is still happening in our universe. It just turns out the universe is way more complicated than you thought, right? Curtis says, the only exposure I've had with Lewis was a prof showing Lewis on this multiverse saying that it was all ad hoc. Yeah, well, it's hard to sort of swallow the pill if it's presented uncharitably, but in my hands, you'd be like, your mind would be blown. So if you get a charitable exposure one day, which is what we need to do in philosophy, you'd think twice about, thinking Lewis is crazy. But Lewis was mindful of the fact that people thought his ideas were crazy. But it turns out they're not. They're actually pretty sensible. And again, we spend a week on that when I do my other metaphysics class. But the point is, this is the story. This is the layout historically, right? What we're reading, what we read in metaphysics is this. Let me give you a flavor, for instance, of the sort of grandiose metaphysics. You saw some grandiose metaphysics, so the X here, right? Heidegger, for instance, right? So Heidegger's Being in Time, that's 1927. So remember the Heidegger passage? Does everyone remember that really cryptic passage about non-being, right? The nothings. Remember that? Yeah, good old the nothings. That's right. So Heidegger, God bless his soul, really smart Nazi, publishes Being in Time in 1927, and it's a landmark book with lots of interesting things to say, but remarkably difficult and problematic in the ways that Carnap points out, right? And so that's pre-Carnap right over here. If you want another flavor of the sort of grandiose metaphysics that exists, like way past, for instance, right? Like, I'm going to just paint a picture for you really briefly. Like, here are all the particular things in the universe. I'm going to put a bunch of, I'm going to say this really briefly. I'm going to paint to you the Neoplatonic picture. Is anyone familiar with Neoplatonism? So that's not Plato, it's Plotinus. Neoplatonism. Type yes if that's familiar, no if you're not. This is going to be a crash course in Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism in 3 minutes, so hold on to your seats, right? So these are all the particular things in the world. So the particular bottle that's on my desk, the particular cat that's currently rummaging through the garbage, the particular cloud, you know, that's there in the sky, the particular clap that you made with your hands, all the particulars in the world, right? And of course, clearly we can group some particulars based on similarities. So for instance, we can say of all the cats, right, that they are cats. I'm just going to write cats over here, right? Because these particular cats, no matter if they're different, and we name them, you know, they mean something to each owner, all the cats share some traits, right? And likewise for the dogs, right? So you can go ahead and you can group all of the dogs and you can say, well, I see all these particular dogs, but the dogs have more in common with each other and they have more in difference with, let's say, other things, and you group them. You use a ratio of similarities and differences to group them and to form an abstract concept, doghood, right, or cathood. And in fact, I should kind of remove the S here because what I'm trying to pick out is the thing that all cats have in common, right? So I could kind of remove the S's here. And then you can look at cats and you can look at dogs and you can look at tigers. And then you can also kind of still squint and still do this kind of balance of similarities and differences. And you can say, well, these are all animals, right? And then you could, and there's still something to be said about that. Like, no matter how cats and dogs are different, they're more similar to each other than they are to, let's say, rocks, right? And then you can say things like, plants, and you can start categorizing all of the particular things. So the world is still made. You're squinting and squinting. That's exactly right. And squinting is our sort of common sense term for abstracting, right? What you're doing is abstracting, abstracting, abstracting. In the medieval tradition, this will be developed to a great extent. And what you're doing is you're leaving out irrelevant, you know, accidents and focusing on the essence and kind of going up and going up. And you'll have, let's say, rocks are going to be over here, right, let's say, and you're starting to build a taxonomy of all of the things in the world and you're getting a structure, right? And then you can sort of say, well, there's animate things, and you can look at the plants and the animals, right? They're living, so you can say animate things, and the rocks are inanimate things. Plants are animate things, by the way. They don't move a lot, but they move. And then you can say, oh, well, the rocks and all the other stuff, tables and chairs, right, they're going to be inanimate. So let me just say inanimate. And of course, all of these things here, animate and inanimate, you can put another big umbrella on top of those, right? And you can say that these are all things, right? And at one point, if you keep going higher and higher up, what we call, this is called a Porphyrian tree after Porphyry. Third century thinker. If you keep going up, eventually what you're going to end up with is kind of like at the top of this tree. And again, all of these kind of go all the way back down to the particulars, right? So these are all ways of tracking individual things. You're probably going to end up with things, events, kind of, you're going to start getting to a very high elevation, right? And then you're going to have to start thinking about, well, what's common to things and events and all of these things. And if you keep going up and up and up, the thing that's going to unite everything, I'm going to let the privilege of Brandon bring it home. Brandon, what are we going to put at the top? Because I kind of know what Brandon's been reading and interested in. What are we going to put at the top? What's the one, and wink, wink, nudge, nudge, what's the one thing? In the Platonic realm, when you get to the really top, right, you have, Plato's going to say, okay, so let's get to the really top here. Let me just kind of zoom in and put some more stuff, because I've kind of maybe skipped a step for you folks, and go to some things that are familiar. When we get to the top, Plato's going to say something like, you're going to get truth, justice, and beauty, or something like this, right? So truth, justice, and beauty, right? You get to these really big abstractions, right? Truth, justice, and beauty. So essentially knowledge, ethics, and aesthetics, right? So the foundational concepts, or the most abstract concepts, truth would be for epistemology, justice would be for ethics, and beauty would be for aesthetics. And now for Plato, you maxed out. So when you get here, this is the thing, this is the story. This is the difference between Neoplatonism and Platonism. When you get to Plato, you get to this. And these are, if you will, three sides of the same coin. It's obviously not going to be a coin because it has three sides. Three sides of the same coin. So this is when you get to the top. Neoplatonism is going to say, Plato missed something. There's actually something above all of this. These are all, again, species-genus relations. These are all species of one genus. And what is the Neoplatonic tradition going to put at the top? The one. Bum, 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 bum. And you got to say bum, 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 bum when you get there, because you're maxing out, right? This prior, undifferentiated state of allness, prior to distinction. And my umbrella here needs to cover the entire range of everything, right? And then Neoplatonism is going to say, well, look, what's at the top? It's the one, it's allness. It's that which is prior to distinction. It's God or whatever, right? And we can, and part of the sleight of hand is to switch between one and God, right? Which is kind of annoying, but it's big. It's a big deal, right? It's the one. And then the Neoplatonic tradition is going to then say, well, look, what exists now? So you have this picture and you say, what exists? And you can say what exists is the one. And that's the most abstract thing you can get. The most concrete thing you can get is particulars. So here's the particulars. And if you zoom in and you focus on each particular, it also can be considered on its own as one thing. So the universe, this is sounding like a grand story now, right? This is getting like everything is in this big cosmic loop. The particular and the universe and the abstract are connected, and everything is just the one, and everything in between is a kind of an illusion, if you will, right? And let me just put these two lines like this. So if you ask the question, what exists, the question of metaphysics, the answer is the one. And then you get these two movements. This is called egress, and this is called regress. So the movement from the particular one to the abstract one is egress, and this is called regress. And then this is a big story. So I promised you I'd give you a big story. Because everyone, can you see how big this is? It doesn't get bigger than this. Can everyone see that? That's metaphysics big style, not the sort I taught you. Not like, how do we explain David Lewis standing up and sitting down, right? Like, pop, 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 boom, right? Now the question is, if you it's a great story. Do you agree? But it's kind of, you can see where Carnap is coming. This is kind of like, this is your way of expressing wonder at the world, really. Because how could I falsify this? Like, how could I show this wrong? Like, how could I begin to say the Neoplatonic story is wrong? Like, it's claiming to be true. Well, to be true means it's not false. Okay? Like, it kind of seems like wordplay. It's inhabiting this kind of space of art masquerading as theory, right? That's kind of, you see that, Chris? And everybody else? This is the kind of stuff that Carnap was concerned to say, what's the status of this? Like, what are we looking at right now? Like, seriously, let's take this step by step. What are we looking at? Is this science? Let's just take it step by step. Let's just eliminate the candidates. Is this science, yes or no? It's not science, man. Like, maybe when you were working your cats and dogs, it looked like biology. But when you get to this one stuff, truth, justice, and beauty, and this one, like, and the thing is, this is metaphysics, right? This is, and It's not logic either. It's not pure logic. It's something else, right? It's talking about the way the world is. So you can't really reduce it to observation. Yeah, it's this weird. It's a different story. It's not nothing, and it's kind of beautiful for what it's worth. I want to put this aside. So this was my Neoplatonism in 3 minutes. My friends, did you enjoy Neoplatonism in 3 minutes? Mission Impossible. Prof explains to you Neoplatonism in 3 minutes. It's beautiful. It's a nice story, right? But so much mileage gets done out of the fact that it's topped off by the one and it's bottomed out by the one, and that, you know, this kind of cosmic story about everything, and like, and a lot of, by the way, mystical mumbo jumbo will be pulled out of Neoplatonism, like a lot of genuine mystical mumbo jumbo, right? That doesn't even at all look like philosophy, right? And I didn't realize you're Neoplaton. But here's the thing, right, Brandon? So let's suppose you say you think this is beautiful and you agree with me, but above and beyond, you think it's beautiful. You think it's an accurate picture of the world. Suppose you say that. So moreover, let's say you say, I'm a Neoplatonist, it turns out. I think this is an accurate depiction of the world. How in the world are you going to justify that? And how in the world could you possibly be shown wrong? Right? Like, let's say you can't. Right? So what space does that inhabit? And this is exactly the kind of nonsense that this sort of Quine was concerned to sort of attack in his 1932 paper. So my friends, this was the grandiose metaphysics that, this is as grandiose a metaphysics as I can find, by the way. So the Neoplatonic story, while still being in philosophy, you want more grandiose, like listen to Deepak Chopra, but I can't give you a more grandiose story while still thinking I'm doing philosophy. So this is as I know a lot about philosophy. The more grandiose stories I get, I'm doing religion. So if I go, for instance, in non-Western or Asian traditions, or even in Western traditions, but it starts to be religion. There's no argument anymore. It's just like complete religion, right? And Schopenhauer read this kind of stuff, by the way. And Schopenhauer, like all folks, is a mix of truth and falsehood. So he's got some parts right and some parts wrong. And that's for another story. But and so that's the sort of grand metaphysics that Carnap wants to destroy. Now, I'm going to delete this, right? And why not logically? That's a good question. So Plato thing is perfectly logical. I don't know, man, those moves, right? They're pretty big when you get near the top. Do you agree, Carl? Like when you're reaching the top, it starts to look pretty iffy. Like if you're going for the similarities and differences, and after the 70th million squint, do you agree, Carl? We're on very shaky terrain. That you're starting to have to kind of squint in a way that you kind of already know where you're going. Yeah, it's getting shakier, agreed. Like if I'm looking at dogs and cats and mammals and I ask the question, is a whale a mammal? I can see how I can settle that question. But when you say, well, you know what? It comes down to three things. At the top, the layer right underneath the one. So suppose I work my way down and I ask you, what's the layer right underneath the one? What does the one break down into? So you've got the one, right? What's its first division? Like suppose I didn't know from the story coming up, right? Suppose I ask you, and there's a disagreement about how it's going to carve into, and how many parts it's going to carve into, and what those parts will be. How are we going to settle disagreement about that? Like you got, some other person says, no, right? It breaks into something else. And like, how are we going to debate about that? Like if we're all singing the same song and we've all were raised on the same story, we're going to see eye to eye, right? And it's shakier because it comes harder and harder to distinguish high-level metaphysical accounts from each other. Exactly right. Exactly right. And it's on very shaky grounds, right? And those disagreements could go on forever, and they have. They have. Like you'll get people arguing about, what's the first division of the one? Like or like in Aquinas, you get God, right? And the first thing that sort of emanates out of God is these angels that just spend their whole time just worshiping God without being God. And he has a name for those. And there's different kinds of angels. Like there's all these concentric rings. So God's the full dot here. And then there's different angels radiating outward. And eventually we get to us, right? We're somewhere over here. But it's like, what the hell is going on here, right? And so that's the sort of metaphysics that Carnap was concerned to destroy. Now, I'm going to continue my story about metaphysics for a little while. But before I move on, this grand metaphysics stuff, is it clear or you have a question? Because actually, I want to wrap up the questions, but is everyone clear on that? Because I can see a few people are really turned on by this stuff, but just to touch base with everybody else. Give myself an excuse to refuel. All right. So let's go back to this drawing for a second. I don't have to sort of remind you what this line is. Okay, metaphysics takes a dip, and then eventually it comes back up like this, right? And I'm going to put the line of philosophical analysis, which kind of took off. One of the reasons also why Quine was successful. So remember, we're over here. We're going to say that Quine shows up and publishes a paper in 1948 called "On What There Is," which is where our ontology paper started. Remember the whole paper about the fat man and the bald man in the doorway, and the Meinong and his imaginary sort of the possible Pegasus and a possible Santa and all that nonsense. This is where Quine, so we're looking at 1948. The thing is, Quine also published a paper. Have you ever heard of a paper called Two Dogmas of Empiricism? Say yes if you haven't. No if you have. Say yes if you have. No if you haven't. Two Dogmas of Empiricism. All right. This is one of the most famous papers in 20th century philosophy. And it's written by Quine. Quine was a student of Carnap. And he basically took out two pegs from underneath Carnap's Jenga. So you can imagine a Jenga structure. Does anyone know what a Jenga structure is? Like take a Jenga puzzle, like it's a big tower, right? All right, so Carnap had a Jenga, right? This was his Jenga tower. And underneath his Jenga had a couple of really key ideas. So his whole structure is philosophical, is his philosophy essentially. And what Quine did was he took out two of these pegs, right? One of the ones that he took out was this distinction between analytic and synthetic statements. So you remember in Quine, we said that things are either nonsense, or, that's an N, or they're logic, or they're empirical statements, right? If they're nonsense, then send them to art, right? Send them to art. If they're logical claims, then send them to the logician. And if they're empirical claims, then send them to whom? So if it's an empirical claim, who do we send it to? The scientist. That's right. Send it to the scientist. And philosophy just the P. That's philosophy. Philosophy is just that's what we do. Is we just kind of figure all this stuff out. So all of that very activity, that's P. That's us. That's philosophy. Right. That's the map of the division of nature, division of labor in what we ought to be doing. So there's artists, logicians, scientists, and philosophers, and we're kind of the philosophy is the information kiosk of the amusement park. I really like that. That's gorgeous, Carl. Carl's sometimes you got hits and misses. That's a hit, my friend Bum Knuckles. The information kiosk at the amusement park. I really like that. That's gonna stick. I'm gonna borrow that one. God bless you, Carl. That was really cool. And so one of the things that Quine is going to say is that there's no sharp distinction. Let me put this in red because there is no such sharp distinction here, right, between the logical and the empirical claims. So one of the dogmas, his paper is called Two Dogmas of Empiricism, right? And that's not the 1948 paper. That's another paper. And he says, although it was delivered, the talk was delivered in London, Ontario, I believe, in 1948. And Quine's going to say there's no such thing, there's no sharp distinction between logical and empirical claims. There's a gradient. They bleed into one another, right? And he's going to justify that in a way that I'm not going to sort of unpack, but he takes out that pillar from underneath Quine, so underneath Carnap. So Carnap's just lost one of his pillars, right? One of the blocks just went. There's no sharp distinction between this. So it's not like you can make a clean distinction between science and logic, and so they're on a spectrum. And moreover, one of the other pillars underneath Carnap's philosophy is the idea of protocol sentences. Remember that the meaning of a word or a sentence has to be transformed into a moment of contact with observation, right? That at some point I should say here, now, blue, as you stare at something, and that's going to confirm or show wrong a claim I've made because we want to assign a truth value to the claim. And I say the sky is blue right now, right? So the sky is not cloudy, the sky is blue. You want to verify that. And at some point I have to tilt your head up at the geographical coordinates, in this case delta, have you look up at the sky, and then you're going to confirm or infirm the fact that I just said that the sky is blue by either seeing blue or seeing another color. Does everyone remember that? If you remember, type in yes. If you don't, type in no. Those are the protocol sentences. Like, I have to give you a recipe for observing the world. That's the empiricism part, right? So Quine's going to take off another dogma. It's like this whole idea that you can reduce these sentences, that also doesn't happen, right? Because I can always, Quine says, we have a web of belief, and I can always readjust the web of belief to both acknowledge what you said and acknowledge what I see and deny what you said. So for instance, think of a flat earther, right? When I do another class, I teach flat earth, and I show an experiment that's being conducted by some folks who are trying to disprove the flat earth theorists, if they can indeed be so called. And there's water and there's a boat that goes sailing with a little, let me use another color for this, with a little flag. And on the flag are, it looks kind of like bars, like dark bars like this, right? And this is a boat. You can imagine a boat holding this huge cardboard, and the boat is sailing away from you. So this is the boat, right? This is the boat is sailing away from you. Let's give it a little flag, and it's holding up this huge thing. And you're on the shore right now, looking at the boat as it sails away from you. Now, if the Earth is round, what should happen, right, as the boat sails away? What should happen as the boat sails away from you? If the Earth is round. So that's like time t1, right? Sailing away from you. What should happen at time t2? So t1's here. Or what should we see at time t2? As it sails farther and farther away. It should sink into the sea. It should slowly disappear over the horizon, right? So there's two possibilities, right? There's two possibilities. I'm going to paint those possibilities as follows. Either it'll just shrink, right? Or it'll go over the horizon. There's two possibilities. So either it just shrinks. If it just shrinks, call this option A. Call this option A. If it just shrinks, then the Earth is flat. And if it shrinks and disappears and starts to tilt, and you can see the lines, the bars, kind of one of the bars just disappeared over the horizon, right? Then the Earth is round, right? So what's going to happen at time t2? This, like, here it goes, it starts, and there's two possibilities. So you have a theory, two conflicting theories, one that says the Earth is flat, one that says the Earth is round. And the flat earthers, what do you think they see when they look into a very powerful lens? What do they think? What do they see, and what do you see, and what does anyone see when we run this experiment? We see A or B? What do we see technically with our eyeballs? Like, what do we see in the lens? It sinks down. So this wins, right? But what does the flat earther believe? Curtis, you can kick in. So this is what the flat earther sees, right? But the flat earther keeps believing in the idea that the Earth is flat. Why? This is what they say. They say, but what you don't think is about, this is a heat wave. So he explains this with heat waves. Heat waves are distorting the image. So this is what they say, heat waves. And I can show you the video. It's like a mirage, right? This heat wave. And the idea is, if you graft another belief to the belief that you see this, so you can acknowledge what you see and deny what the other person claims. So the protocol sentence, this is as Carnapian as it gets. Look here now. What do you see? Do you see the two lines or do you see one, right? So that's the test. Do you see two lines or do you see one? Like it should start dipping over the horizon. And Quine is going to point out that if you annex, beliefs are a matter of an overall consideration in your web of belief. If you annex other beliefs there, you can still refuse to accept the claim even while you sort of observe the protocol sentence. Curtis says, I had to deal with a new coworker yesterday, was training the first day and brought up the Earth was flat. And that's when I knew not to talk philosophy with them. But it's an interesting subject matter as a case study for epistemology and metaphysics. Think about it, right? And don't have that conversation with that person, right? But Quine's point is that since our beliefs are assessed on the whole, the fact that we observe something is not definitive. So for instance, let me give you an example. You're walking, let me give you another example now. You're walking in Hollywood, right? And you see, for instance, a car. This is my car. You're on a Hollywood set. You see a car, and there's smoke coming from the car. Do you believe that the car is on fire? So you see the smoke coming from the car. Do you believe that the car is on fire? You're watching the filming of Lethal Weapon 18. You see a bunch of people around. Action! And they're filming, right? They're filming. Here's the camera. You might think it's a special effects, right? You might assume it's a fake scenario. So here's the thing. You still see the smoke. So the protocol sentence, if I said the car is burning and I put you in the position of looking, right? So here's your eyeball and you're looking. This is your eyeball and you're looking. The protocol sentence says, look here now, don't you see what I'm saying is true? You'd be like, no, there's other considerations. So what that's going to mean for Carnap is he's about to lose 2 pillars underneath his Jenga structure, right? His Jenga structure is going to lose some pillars. You can't reduce to observation. That whole story of reducing to observation doesn't work. The whole story about protocol sentences, you lose, right? So that's Quine's work. And the other thing that's going to go is the whole idea that you can distinguish sharply between the truths of logic and the truths of observation. It's actually a gradient, so that's got to go, and that goes. And the consensus is that Quine basically destroyed Carnap, and that Carnap's philosophy is untenable anymore. And the dogma of, he calls them 2 dogmas of empiricism. One of them is the idea that you can reduce to protocol sentences, that's called the verificationism. So the whole story about the meaning of something is its conditions for its verification, that's got to go. And the analytic synthetic distinction. So this idea that there are truths that are true in virtue of meaning alone, and truths that are true in virtue of what we observe, that's also got to go. And Quine is going to take, Carnap's going to take Quine's criticisms to heart, and he's going to have to then find another way to criticize and to sort of recapture his stance against metaphysics without employing those 2 things. It's Carnap the revenge, but without making those assumptions about reducing to observation. It's going to be a different, you're going to see it's a different account. All right, so let's have at it. Empiricism, semantics, and ontology. And Sumdish, I told you we'd start with the numbers. So Sumdish, this one's for you. Are there properties, classes, numbers, propositions? In order to understand more clearly the nature of these and related problems, it is above all necessary to recognize a fundamental distinction between 2 kinds of questions concerning the existence or reality of entities. If someone wishes to speak in his language about a new kind of entities, he has to introduce a system of new ways of speaking, subject to new rules. We call this procedure the construction of a linguistic framework for the new entities in question. And now we must distinguish 2 kinds of questions of existence. First, questions of the existence of certain entities of the new kind within the framework. We call them internal questions. And second, questions concerning the existence or reality of the system of entities as a whole, called external questions. Internal questions and possible answers to them are formulated with the help of the new forms of expressions. The answers may be found either by purely logical methods or by empirical methods, depending upon whether the framework is a logical or factual one. An external question is of a problematic character, which is in need of closer examination. Let us consider as an example the simplest kind of entities dealt with in the everyday language, the spatio-temporally ordered system of observable things and events. Once we've accepted the thing language, so you and I, we speak the thing language. Can you hand me that thing over there, right? Once we've accepted the thing language with its framework for things, we can raise and answer internal questions. For instance, is there a white piece of paper on my desk? That's an internal question. These questions are to be answered by empirical investigations, like you check, yeah, there's a white paper on my desk, according to certain rules as confirming or disconfirming evidence for possible answers. This evaluation is usually carried out, of course, as a matter of habit rather than a deliberate rational procedure, but it is possible in a rational reconstruction to lay down explicit rules for the evaluation. This is one of the main tasks of a pure, as distinguished from psychological, epistemology. To recognize something as a real thing or event means to succeed in incorporating it into the system of things at a particular space-time position so that it fits together with the other things as real according to the rules of the framework. So for instance, the thing language says you can't have 2 things in the same spot at the same time. So who's sitting in my chair? Mark is sitting in the chair, and you figure out whether that's true or false by checking out. And then you say, well, Mark's sitting in the chair, and that means some dish is not sitting in Mark's chair, right? And that's all fine. We can establish these claims. Mark exists. He's a thing in the chair. From these questions, we must distinguish the external question of the reality of the thing world itself. In contrast to the former questions, this question is raised neither by the man in the street nor by the scientists, but only by philosophers. Realists give an affirmative answer, subjective idealists a negative one, and the controversy goes on for centuries without ever being solved. And it cannot be solved because it is framed in a wrong way. To be real in the scientific sense means to be an element of the system. Hence, this concept cannot be meaningfully applied to the system itself. Those who raise the question of the reality of the thing world itself have perhaps in mind not a theoretical question as their formulation seems to suggest, but rather a practical question. We have to make a choice whether or not to accept and use the forms of expression in the framework in question. In the case of this particular example, there's usually no deliberate choice because we all have accepted the thing language early in our lives as a matter of course. Nevertheless, we may regard it as a matter of decision in this sense. We're free to choose to continue using the thing language or not. In the latter case, we could restrict ourselves to a language of sense data or other phenomenal entities, or construct an alternative to the customary thing language with another structure. Or finally, we could refrain from speaking. If someone decides to accept the thing language, there's no objection against saying that he's accepted the world of things. But this must not be interpreted as if it meant his acceptance of a belief in the reality of the thing world. There is no such belief or assertion or assumption because it is not a theoretical question. The acceptance of the thing language leads on the basis of observations made also to the acceptance, belief, and assertion of certain statements, like barks in the chair or there's a white paper on the desk. But the thesis of the reality of the thing world cannot be among these statements because it cannot be formulated in the thing language, or it seems in any other theoretical language. Like, think about it. The thing language is not itself a thing. The decision of accepting the thing language, although itself not of a cognitive nature, will nevertheless usually be influenced by theoretical knowledge. The purposes for which the language is intended to be used, for instance, the purpose of communicating factual knowledge, will determine which factors are relevant for the decision. The efficiency, fruitfulness, and simplicity of the use of the thing language may be among the decisive factors. But these questions cannot be identified with the question of realism. They are not yes and no questions, but questions of degree. The thing language in the customary form works indeed with a high degree of efficiency for most purposes of everyday life. This is a matter of fact based upon the content of our experiences. However, it would be wrong to describe this situation by saying, quote, the fact of the efficiency of the thing language is confirming evidence for the reality of the thing world. We should rather say instead, this fact makes it advisable to accept the thing language. As an example of a system which is of a logical rather than a factual nature, let us take the system of natural numbers. The framework for the system is constructed by introducing into the language new expressions with suitable rules. 1, numerals like 5 and sentence forms like there are 5 books on the table. 2, the general term number for the new entities and sentence forms like 5 is a number. 3, expressions for properties of numbers, odd or prime number, relations, greater than, and functions, plus, and sentence forms like 2 plus 3 is 5. 4, numerical variables, m, n, etc., and quantifiers for universal sentences. For every n and existential sentences, there is an n such that, with the customary deductive rules. Here again, there are internal questions. Is there a prime number greater than 100? That's an internal question. Here, however, the answers are not found by empirical investigation based on observations, but by logical analysis based on the rules for the new expressions. Therefore, the answers are here analytic, i.e. logically true. What is now the nature of the philosophical question concerning the existence or reality of numbers? To begin with, there's an internal question which, together with the affirmative answer, can be formulated into new terms, say by there are numbers, or more explicitly, there is an n such that n is a number. This statement follows the analytic statement 5 is a number and is therefore itself analytic. Moreover, it's rather trivial in contradistinction to a statement like there's a prime number greater than 1,000,000, which is likewise analytic but far from trivial, because it does not say more than that the new system is not empty. But this is immediately seen from the rule which states that words like 5 are suitable for the new variables. Therefore, nobody who meant the question, are there numbers, in the internal sense would either assert or even seriously consider a negative answer. Philosophers who treat the question of the existence of numbers as a serious philosophical problem and offer lengthy arguments on either side do not have in mind the internal question. And indeed, if we were to ask them, do you mean the question as to whether the framework of numbers, if we were to accept it, would be found to be empty or not? They would probably reply, not at all. We mean a question prior to the acceptance of the new framework. They might try to explain what they mean by saying that it is the question of the ontological status of numbers, the question whether or not numbers have a certain metaphysical characteristic called reality. However, these philosophers have not succeeded in giving to the external question and to the possible answers any cognitive content. Unless and until they supply a clear cognitive interpretation, we're justified in our suspicion that their question is a pseudo-question, that is, one disguised in the form of a theoretical question, while in fact it is a non-theoretical. In the present case, it is the practical problem of whether or not to incorporate into the language the new linguistic forms which constitute the framework of numbers. From the internal questions, we must clearly distinguish external questions, in other words, philosophical questions concerning the existence or reality of the total system of the new entities. Many philosophers regard an external question of this kind as an ontological question which must be raised and answered before the introduction of the new language forms. The latter introduction, they believe, is legitimate only if it can be justified by an ontological insight supplying an affirmative answer to the question of reality. In contrast to this view, we, that is Carnap, take the position that the introduction of the new ways of speaking does not need any theoretical justification because it does not imply any assertion of reality. To be sure, we have to face at this point an important question, but it is a practical, not a theoretical question. It is the question of whether or not to accept the new linguistic forms. The acceptance cannot be judged as being either true or false because it's not an assertion. It can only be judged as being more or less expedient, fruitful, conducive to the aim for which the language is intended. Our previous discussion concerning the acceptance of frameworks enables us now to clarify the situation with respect to abstract entities as designata, things that are referred to. Let us take as an example the statement, 5 designates a number. And notice 5 is in brackets here, so it's being mentioned, not used. 5 designates a number. The word 5 designates a number. The formulation of this statement presupposes that our language L contains the forms of expression which we have called the framework of numbers, in particular numerical variables and the general term number. If L contains these forms, the following is an analytic statement in L. 5, now not using it now, not mentioning it, 5, no brackets around it, 5 is a number. True. Further, to make the statement A possible, L must contain an expression like designates or is a name of for the semantical relation of designation. If suitable rules for this new term are laid down, the following is likewise analytic. 5, with brackets, designates 5, without brackets. Since A follows from C and B, A is likewise analytic. So you say 5, the word designates a number. 5 is a number, and 5, the word designates 5. Therefore, you can then say that 5, the word designates a number. It is thus clear that if someone accepts the framework of numbers, then he must acknowledge C and B and hence A as true statements. Notice the if someone accepts the framework of numbers. Thus, the question of the admissibility of entities of a certain type or of abstract entities in general, as designata, is reduced to the question of the acceptability of the linguistic framework for those entities. Let me pause. If you want to start talking about numbers, you get the existence of numbers presupposed for free. That's literally what he's saying. If you buy into number talk, of course numbers exist because you can go from this to this to this, right? And you get it for free. It's trivial. The question is, why should you accept the number talk? Why should I get into this rule? So let's just take a pause for a moment and let me give you a variation on this and then we'll resume. Dungeons and Dragons. Let's say that's a system. Anyone ever played Dungeons and Dragons? Type yes if you have, and no if you've never even heard of it. Dungeons and Dragons. Every week. Oh, good. I'm lucking out. Every week. All right, it's a role-playing game, right? Think of Lord of the Rings, but with little characters and dice that you roll and cards and stuff, all right? Now, in Dungeons and Dragons, Ashley, do you agree there are trolls, Trolls, like not internet trolls, but like trolls with the zits and like there's trolls, right? Yeah, sometimes, right? But sometimes is enough. How many trolls do we need in Dungeons and Dragons to say there exist trolls in Dungeons and Dragons, like Bigfoot? You just need one. There you go, right? So we're good to go. So do you agree that in Dungeons and Dragons, when you step into that language system, it's got its own little rules. It's its own little world with games, right? So like, for instance, you can say things like, you know, the word troll in parentheses designates troll, right? And then you can say, like you can say all the things that he's just said, right? So you can say troll, I'm going to write it in a chat bar. Troll, let's do A, right? Designates a monster, right? This is a correct claim in Dungeons and Dragons. Do we agree? Troll designates a monster, what I've just typed in the chat bar. And again, don't be, if the fan people don't correct me, like if I'm getting some nuances wrong, right? And then you say, let's do a parallel for B, right? Trolls are monsters. So the first thing I just typed had parentheses around it, so I'm mentioning it, not using it, right? Trolls are monsters, right? Oh, see, not monsters, but monsters. That equivalent to B. Do you agree? Like in that language, in the circle. So this is the D&D world, right? In D&D, trolls are monsters, right? It's like, all right, so troll designates a monster. That was that was fine, right? And then, so then I can infer from those two things. So you take the first claim I wrote, right? And then you can say troll designates, well, actually, let me, instead of the previous one I did, so trolls are, let's say horrible. So let's say horrible instead, right? So the first claim I wrote was troll designates a monster. Let's say trolls are horrible. Then I can say trolls designates a horrible thing or something like that, a horrible thing, something like this. I can infer that. Does everyone see that? Type in clear if that's clear. Like in Dungeons and Dragons, I can do all those moves and they kind of follow. I can make those inferences, right? Like I have words, they define certain things, and then I can kind of draw that. I can bounce back and forth, and so in the world of Dungeons and Dragons. So let's kind of ask an internal question, right? So here's an internal question. So look at my eye here. I'm putting an eye inside the D&D world. In D&D world, do trolls exist? Yes or no? And Ashley said at least one, right? So trolls exist, right? There is such a thing, such that there's such an X, such that X is a troll. So internal question: do trolls exist? If you're buying into this, now the external question is it advisable to take on the Dungeons and Dragons language? Yes or no? As a kind of your way of figuring out stuff in life in general. Like you're going to step out in the world, you're about to take the bus. Is it advisable? Let me use the language that Carnap used, right? Is it advisable? So Chris says no. And do you agree? Like it's not advisable to go step out in the world thinking that Dungeons and Dragons is the way you're going to sort out the world? Do we agree? Like the Dungeons and Dragons framework, let's use Carnap's language, the framework of D&D, the framework of Dungeons and Dragons, it's not advisable to do that. So Chris, why? So Chris said no. Chris doesn't want to use D&D as a way of sorting out his life. Why not, Chris? I'm tempted to agree with you, but why not? And someone else can join in. Anyone who doesn't want to use Dungeons and Dragons, like Ashley who plays Dungeons and Dragons. Ashley, do you go about, when you're not playing Dungeons and Dragons, do you take it seriously as a description of the world? Do you go out and use that to make, like, because the trolls don't exist in real life. It's not going to be, like, do we agree that it's not practical? Like, it would not be practical, right? You don't believe in its ontology. Why, though? I'm asking the why. I know you don't, but I'm asking why, Brandon. So dig deeper. Right, so dig deeper than that. It's true. So you're not buying into the D&D world, right? You're not going to use that framework to describe the world. And the question of whether or not to employ the Dungeons and Dragons, that's an external question. It's a question of practicality. It's impractical. Would you agree, Brandon? That's why you don't believe in it. Like, Are you ever going to need to cast a spell on a troll? Is this ever going to be a possible experience for you? I was in the SkyTrain, right? And a troll came over, right? It's not so much that it's not empirical, it's completely useless. It's doing no work for you. Do you see that, Brandon? Right? Because you don't want to sort of, that's not as helpful. It's not empirical means you can't see it. There's lots of stuff you can't see. Like, for instance, I don't know that you've seen a lot of giant squid, but you could see a giant squid, right? There's no reason, though, for you to sort of, you have no reason to suspect that it'd be practical for you to sort of embrace that language, right? Now let's compare the world of Dungeons and Dragons with the world of math for a second, right? In the world of math, so this is the math world now, it's not Dungeons and Dragons. Inside the circle, do numbers exist, yes or no? Once you step inside that framework, do numbers exist? Yeah. And do they exist in virtue of some fancy argument? No, they just exist trivially because it's a non-empty framework. It's got stuff it's talking about. It's not an empty set. So you get the existence of numbers for free. That's the internal questions. If I ask the internal questions, I can say something like, is 4 an odd number? And there's a yes or no question to that. But if I say, does 4 exist? It's like, of course it exists. Once I've got my feet planted inside. The external question then is it advisable for you to embrace the mathematics language? Yes or no? Tell me your preference. Is it advisable? And I'm using language that Carnap wants us to use here. Is it your preference, right? Yeah, it's advisable. It's your preference. Why? Because it's supremely practical. Look at all the work you get to do with it. It's not now that you're burdened with pointing to the number 4. So now if I ask you, for instance, based on Carnap, okay, so in the internal question, right, you can say things like 4 is an even number, right? And you can say things like 4 exists because that's trivially true. If 4 is an even number, therefore 4 exists, right? So if the claim above is true, let's put this as a premise to a conclusion. This thing at the top is a premise, P. 4 is an even number. Sorry if this is ugly. Conclusion, therefore 4 exists. Do we agree? If the premise is true that 4 is an even number, you can infer that 4 exists. Can we all agree that's an argument? If the premise is true, then conclusion has to be true, right? It's an even number, right? And again, you don't need to even worry about that kind of stuff, Brandon, because Brandon, that's an even number, isn't that synthetic? Like, who the hell cares? Help yourself to the premise as being true. The conclusion has to be true, right? It has to exist. The thing you're talking about has to exist. And you get that existence for free. Clearly, of course, right? In that, like, you get it for free. And you don't need to argue. In fact, no one ever stops to argue for this stuff. Once you're in the thing language, you never wonder about the existence of things. You ask, where are my keys? Where'd I put my car keys? You don't say, do car keys exist? Are things a thing, right? You say, where did I put my car keys? So the thing language, let's do this again with the thing language. Here's the thing language. In the thing language, this is one framework. Inside the thing language, I'm going to ask questions about where the hell are my keys? Okay, question mark, right? Where the hell are my keys? But I don't ask, do things exist? What's a thing? I don't bother with these things. In the thing language, I'm like just concerned with internal questions. External questions are going to be things like, is it advisable? That's the external question. Is it advisable to take on the thing language? So notice the thing. There's a bifurcation here. Either, let me put a big fat dot here. Either you're asking the question from inside the circle, in which case the existence follows trivially, or you're asking the question from outside the circle, in which case is contingent only on its practicality, because the question can't be phrased as a theoretical one because there's no theory you've actually embraced. Can everyone see that? Is that clear? If that's clear, type in clear. If you have a question, ask your question. This is kind of the disjunction, right? So it's either you're asking that question from the inside. I'll say it again, Ariana, right? So either you're asking the question from the inside. If you're asking it from the inside, then of course the thing you're talking about exists. So run that for Dungeons and Dragons, run that for numbers, run that for things, right? From the inside, the things we're talking about, of course they exist. From the outside, the only thing you can ask about it is this a language worth playing? Is this a language worth employing? Because it's not like once you're on the outside and you're asking, should I even bother to get into the system? There's no resources in the system to tell you whether or not you should step in it, right? Like, is there something inside the Dungeons and Dragons universe that justifies the adoption of the Dungeons and Dragons universe? So someone who's a D&D player, tell me, have you ever read a book in Dungeons and Dragons that says why you should play Dungeons and Dragons? Confirm that to me. I'm almost certain there isn't. I suppose there's none, right? You adopt. So if you adopt Dungeons and Dragons, then these things follow as a matter of course. But embracing the antecedent of that conditional, that's you showing up to the game shop, right? Nothing forces you to accept that game shop, to walk in there, right, and to accept it. Likewise, in our ordinary talk of things, is it helpful to say things are a thing? Like, we never bother. Because, of course, in the framework, things are a thing. Of course they are. We're talking about things. We never bother to say things are a thing. Where's the only place where you wonder whether things are a thing? In philosophy, outside that circle. When you step outside that framework, you wonder, are things a thing? It's an external question. Exactly, Ariana. And Carnap's point is going to be, like, there's a confusion. Metaphysics is asking an external question, and expecting it to be settled in the same manner that an internal question can be settled. Let me say that again slowly. His 1950 paper rephrases his basic criticism of metaphysics, which is the same that basically you saw, but now it's reworded in a way that takes language in its totality. You can see the influence of Quine here. Instead of treating sentences on their whole, the unit here is the totality of the linguistic framework, the totality of the framework. He's a holist now. He's grabbing the whole system, and that's the influence of Quine. And he's asking, the problem with metaphysics is it tries to find an internal style answer to an external question. Is that clear, Ariana? Do you see that, everybody else? That's this criticism, and we're going to keep reading. I mean, I'm just taking a pause here to kind of clarify, because this was getting really heavy. I want to touch base with Reese, Sumdish, and Sumdish, we promised you some love about the numbers. Sumdish, how are you feeling about the story about numbers, by the way? It's a story about what you should say about numbers. Of course, they exist inside the circle, and if you want to ask whether to step into the circle, that's a practical question. They exist trivially inside the circle, and then you kind of, whether or not you want to step in the circle, you know, it's definitely a reread. I agree. So let's keep going, right? I think this is going to get clearer, but Carnap, to his credit, is going to keep unpacking this, right? Suppose that one philosopher says, I believe that there are numbers as real entities. This gives me the right to use the linguistic forms of the numerical framework. His opponent replies, you're wrong. There are no numbers. The numerals may still be used as meaningful expressions, but they're not names. There are no entities designated by them. I cannot think of any possible evidence that would be regarded as relevant by both philosophers, and therefore, if actually found, would decide the controversy, or at least make one of the opposite theses more probable than the other. Therefore, I feel compelled to regard the external question as a pseudo-question until both parties to the controversy offer a common interpretation that would involve possible evidence regarded as relevant by both sides. Otherwise, it'll be like a conversation with the flat earther. Right? Flat earther just doesn't want to step into the circle. Well, this is a nice other example. Here's us. Here's the round earth language. This is the round earth framework. The flat earther person, is he inside or outside the circle? Where do they plant their feet? The flat earther. Inside or outside this framework? Inside or outside the circle? Outside. They're over here. And whether they're planting their circle, they're going in another framework. This is the flat earth framework. In the flat earth framework, by the way, you can explain everything that you can explain. Flat earth, what do they do about Antarctica? What do they do about the fact that we fly in circles, like around the world? All these things, there's a story in the flat earth story, right? And then this is you, right? So you can step outside and ask the external question, which is more advisable to adopt? The flat earth framework or the round earth framework? In the flat earth framework, it follows trivially that the earth is flat. And in the round earth framework, it follows trivially that the earth is round. And then the external question is, which is more advisable for you to adopt? Right? Would you rather say that it's dipping over the horizon, or would you rather say that there's heat waves? Pick your poison. Right? It's like, because you can explain the phenomena, by the way, huh? Oh, and the flat Earth people think the sky is a dome with holes in it and little lights. You can observe that, by the way. Tonight, go out and look. It looks like a dome. So in the middle of the night, Get up when the sun's going to set. When it's set, go look, and you can see the celestial vault. It really looks like a dome. And by the way, the sun does turn around the earth and not the other way around. It sets in the west every day. Go look. You can go and look. Like we live in the, look at the Pacific Ocean tonight. You're going to observe confirming observation for the flat earth theory. You really will, which is why it was believed for so long. And the question is, which is it more advisable to take on? And the metaphysic problems is going to be to say, is to think that you can settle those kinds of external questions as if you can settle them as an internal question, with just like more investigation. And that's why it was foolish for the Science Channel to kind of show the experiment that they did, because the adoption of the flat earth framework is done, by the way, let me give you an example. Let me give you a quick question. Why are flat earthers, why do they believe in the flat earth? What's your theory? Why do they believe in flat earth? Give me your best example. And we might have a flat earther among us, so who cares? Government mistrust, all sorts of stories. I think Sumdish is on the right track. So the Bible, in part, what happens, the flat earth people find their worldview more meaningful. Think about when we ended the last paper, metaphysics is an expression of your attitude towards life. If you're a flat earther, who's at the center of the universe? If you believe in the flat earth theory, where are we with respect to the coordinates of the universe? We're right smack in the center. We're important. We've got the money spot, right? It's meaning. They're trying to find religious meaning, right? No, see, that's the thing you don't understand. You'll never understand flat earth theory if you say things like egoism, paranoia, fallacies, no. The real motive for embracing the flat earth is it's a meaningful worldview. In that worldview, and you can hear literally the flat earth people say this, and I wish I could show you the video. You have folks who are telling you that the world that they're buying into is a more meaningful world, right? It's a world where we're not hairless apes on some rock floating randomly through space, I believe is the expression that they use. Let me just kind of give myself a space to work with for a moment. Instead of writing over this thing, let me just see what page we were at. All right, here we go. Let me give myself a space to work with. Here's a framework in Carnap sense, right? Here's another framework in Carnap sense. One of the frameworks is going to be the flat earth, and this is going to be the round earth. Inside the framework, what do you get? So now I'm going to type in some of the advantages and disadvantages of the framework. Well, look, in the flat earth framework, you have to buy into a conspiracy, right? A very wide-ranging one, by the way. You have to get you have to buy into a conspiracy. But what also do you get? You get lots of meaning, right? It's meaningful in a quasi-religious sense, or meaning of life, right? In a meaning of life sense, right? And here, true, right? You have no conspiracy, all right? So you don't have to countenance a conspiracy, so you got no conspiracy. But, in the standard world that science recommends, truth be told, certainly by comparison with, religions, for instance, there's also no meaning. The Big Bang happened for no reason. Life on the earth is just an accident and whatnot, right? You'll never understand what's going on unless you understand this. And you know what I'm going to do now, and this is the part that's going to be disturbing, right? For those of you who are attracted to it, I'm going to put this over here. And I'm going to put, my markers are going to be too thick. This is the Neoplatonic framework of the one. Remember the good old one? This is the one, right? It's a meaningful framework. Those of you who were drawn to it, right, were like, that's nice, man. I want to believe in that. Call me a Neoplatonist now. That's a meaningful worldview. It ties everything together. The cosmos has some order, right? All of these frameworks can explain everything that you observe. Let me say that again. All of the frameworks that are on the screen right now can explain everything that's observable. In different ways, mind you, but there's no observation that's kind of outside their reach. And then you stand out there and the external question is, which framework is it advisable for you to adopt? That's the external question. Which framework is it advisable for you to adopt? And you can't argue with someone who's buying into the one story And you can't argue against someone who buys into the flat earth story. And you can't argue with someone who buys into the round earth story because they're as dogmatic. Why? It's not going to move. Within each of those frameworks, those questions are easily settled. And the external question is, should I adopt either of those frameworks? Within them, everything is explained. And is it advisable for me to do that or that? Can everyone see that more clearly now? I notice flat earth is easy to pick on, huh? But the one, same thing, huh? And let's not go into the nitty-gritty detail of the conspiracy, right? So I agree, Carl. If you keep pushing, there's a reason why conspiracy theories. No, I'm not even going to bother going and zeroing in on that because that's kind of veering off topic. There's a price to pay for conspiracy theories. So conspiracies suck. They come at a cost. But meaning of life is good. We're not just kind of hairless apes floating on a rock randomly through space. And look, my friends, truth be told, I'm going to tell you, when I go down on 72nd, when I'm going to school, I cross a Gurdwara, I cross a mosque, and I cross a Christian church. And sorry, newsflash, those traditions are attracting way more people than KPU. And who the hell cares about the truth if you're giving meaning? So the external question is, what do you want to attach weights to? Like, what do you want? What matters? What do you want out of your framework, right? The framework, once you're in, settles things for you, right? The question is, what do you want out of your framework? What work do you want it to do for you? And that's Carnap's argument. And the metaphysical problem is to think that you can somehow, and notice the pro-science folks are doing exactly the same kind of mistake that Carnap is flagging. This is a flag. They're trying to argue as if the question of whether to adopt the round earth framework can be settled by an appeal to an internal question like, look at the flag, do the bars disappear? And they're committing exactly the problem that Carnap says is bound to have a problem. Like, kind of like if you ask me to look around and you think, well, Mark, haven't you seen the similarities between the cats and dogs? And you think that somehow it's going to get me to adopt the one framework, right? Or someone who'd be, spending time on the internet and browsing, flagging that mistake. These are all problems, right? These are all fooled endeavors. And this one's not off the hook, huh? It's not off the hook. And they're making zero progress because they don't understand what's going on, right? The adoption of a worldview cannot be settled by questions within a worldview because they presuppose the adoption of that worldview. Let me say that again slowly because it's super important. The adoption of a worldview cannot be justified from within the worldview, for that would presuppose the adoption of the worldview. Does that make sense, everyone? Can you see that? That's exactly what Carnap is saying. Like, you'd have to stand both feet in it to justify that you should come in it. It's like I'm saying, come in this restaurant, it's good, and I'm trying to convince you to be in the restaurant. Like, I'm standing in the restaurant and I'm saying, come to the restaurant. I'm already in the restaurant for you to hear my reasons. You'd have to walk into the restaurant. Can everyone see that analogy? Like, imagine I'm standing. I'll tell you the good reason for stepping into a Gurdwara if you step in the Gurdwara and hear my reasons. I'm trying to convince you to walk through the door. And I'll sit there inside and I'll tell you the reasons for why you should go in only once you've come in. Can everyone see that? Like, make it a space. Make the circle an actual enclosure. And presuppose that someone's outside of the enclosure and you're trying to convince them to come in, and you'll say, I'll give you reasons inside the enclosure. Is that clear, everyone? Because these are big ideas, right? We're doing philosophy at its high level, metaphysics, like standing outside metaphysical frameworks and shopping around. So remember, I'm just going to pick up where we left off. We were here. Suppose that one philosopher, so now he's concerned with whether or not you should step into the Gurdwara of numbers, right? Should you step into the framework that uses numbers? Suppose that one philosopher says, I believe there are numbers as real entities. This gives me the right to use the linguistic forms of the numerical framework. His opponent replies, you're wrong. There are no numbers. The numerals may still be used as meaningful expressions, but they are not names. There are no entities designated by them. I cannot think of any possible evidence that would be regarded as relevant by both philosophers, and therefore, if actually found, would decide the controversy or at least make one of the opposite theses more probable than the other. And likewise for flat Earth. You're always going to run into a stalemate. Here's an example of a stalemate in the history of philosophy. Certain British empiricists denied the existence of abstract entities on the grounds that immediate experience presents us only with particulars, not with universals. For instance, with this red patch, not with redness or color in general, with this scalene triangle, not with scalene triangularity or triangularity in general. Only entities belonging to a type of which examples were to be found within immediate experience could be accepted as the ultimate constituents of reality. Thus, according to this way of thinking, the existence of abstract entities could be asserted only if one could either show that some abstract entities fall within the given, or that abstract entities can be defined in terms of the types of entities which are given. Since the empiricists found no abstract entities within the realm of sense data, they either denied their existence, but some contemporary philosophers think in basically similar terms, right? And so that's, once you're in there, it's like, this is unacceptable, right? So reference to space-time points, electromagnetic field, or electrons in physics, to real or complex numbers and their functions in mathematics, to the excitatory potential or unconscious complexes in psychology, to an inflationary trend in economics and the like, do not imply the assertion that entities of these kinds occur as immediate data, right? So that's the question of, well, I can't see the number 5. Where's inflation? I can't see inflation, right? And so some people think you ought not to believe in these things. And so the decisive question is not the alleged ontological question of the existence of abstract entities, but rather the question that the use of variables beyond those of things of phenomenal data is expedient or fruitful. Is this actually doing work for you? And here is the conclusion. To decree dogmatic prohibitions of certain linguistic forms instead of testing them by their success or failure in practical use is worse than futile. It is positively harmful because it may obstruct scientific progress. The history of science shows examples of such prohibitions based on prejudices deriving from religious, mythological, metaphysical, and other irrational sources, which slowed up the developments for shorter or longer periods of time. Let us learn from the lessons of history. Let us grant to those who work in any special field of investigation the freedom to use any form of expression which seems useful to them. The work in the field will sooner or later lead to the elimination of those forms which have no useful function. And that's how he solves the problems of that. And that's his 1950 paper. This is Carnap now, and you can see where Quine comes in. We can slowly end on this. Quine comes in 2 ways, right? There's no more appeal to protocol sentences. Did you notice? There's no more like the senseless stuff, if it doesn't reduce to protocol sentence, right? None of that shows up anymore. And the unit of significance now is the whole, the totality of all the language, the web of belief in Quine's sense, right? Using the whole system and asking oneself, and the sort of, yeah, he gave up the protocol sentences and the verificationist theory stuff. Yeah, he did as a result of his student, right? Because his student ran a bulldozer through his bulldozer. That's what we do, right? It's like, I love you very much, but like, no. And then we run a bulldozer. And there's some truth. I think it was hastily discarded. There's obviously some truth to it all. So you don't give up something completely. There was obviously something to be said. But it's not like that story is as simple and clean and clear-cut as he once thought it was. And a lot of counterexamples surface, right? And also the idea of practicality. So Quine is a pragmatist. Quine's read the American Pragmatists. So remember what I said about Carnap coming to the United States. Remember I talked about how right around the time that Carnap was doing his thing, the Second World War happened, not just his paper, and Quine moved to the States and then had a bunch of students, and his students were doing philosophy Carnap style because he came to the States. Well, guess what? There's an indigenous, philosophical tradition on American soil called American Pragmatism, right? That's homegrown. So Peirce and William James and John Dewey, and as the classic American pragmatists, there is a philosophical tradition that has grown up and emerged from, it's purely American, right? And it's not like identifiable to rationalism or empiricism or any of the European traditions that sort of, that were around at the time. And so when Quine came into contact with Carnap, and Carnap came into contact with, like everyone comes into contact, Quine's an American, with American pragmatism, it starts to color how people see things. And pragmatism is going to say this. This is what pragmatism is going to say. Because so far we've been asking, right, is there such a thing as whatever, right? So like, is there such a X, such that X is a thing, right? But that's the question that we've been asking. And the answer to that question is, let's say yes or no, right? So someone says yes and someone says no, right? The American pragmatist is going to say, right, if that's an if, right? If you accept the framework, so if F, right, then it exists. So if you accept the framework, here in this case, the thing framework, then there exists a thing. Now, you've all studied a little bit of logic, if nothing else with me. Is there anything in a conditional by itself as a compound proposition that compels you to affirm its antecedent? So if you just look at a conditional proposition, is there anything in a conditional proposition that says you must thereby affirm its antecedent? That is the if part. No. A modus ponens would do it, but the conditional itself is just if then, right? There's nothing in it that forces you to assert it. So what decides to assert it? You. It's an act of practical, it's the will. It's you decide to nod yes, right? You will it. You say, I'm going to now accept it because I will my acceptance. I decide. It's a decision. I will accept this framework. If I accept the framework, then these things exist. If I accept the framework. But you stand outside the framework in making this act of the will, right? It's like, what makes you accept science? Like, let's assume that most of you kind of buy into the scientific story of the world. Is there a scientific story for why you should buy into the scientific story of the world? There can't be, on pain of being circular. There can't be a scientific justification for the acceptance of scientific justification. Can everyone see that? Type in C if you can see that. There can't be a scientific justification for the acceptance of a scientific justification. That would be purely circular. Like my buzzer would go on. I'd be like, no, no. So when you decide to accept science, you've at some point decided, you probably inherited the scientific worldview the same way you inherited the thing language and the same way you inherited English. Did any of you decide to speak English, by the way? Most of us, I think, just kind of, it got vomited on us. It just happened to be the way it is, right? Same thing for the scientific worldview. If I raise you in medieval Europe in the 900s, you'd see the earth is flat. Why? Because it's just what you would inherit. And then you decide to adopt these things, right? But there's no rationale. And they do the work of fitting with experience either way, right? And this is, Brandon says, it feels like there's no way to understand the inner from outside of it. Well, on the outside, it's the wild, bloody West, right? So here's metaphysics. So this is the biggest drawing of metaphysics I could draw. Here are all the systems of metaphysics. Do the history of philosophy, learn them all. Right? So one of them is this, one of them is that. So that's Plato, that's Aristotle, that's Plotinus, that's Parmenides, that's Lao Tzu. God bless Lao Tzu, man. That's what you want to talk about in metaphysics. That's on crack. So we have all these different systems of metaphysics. That's Schopenhauer, that's Hegel, that's all these systems of metaphysics. All right, which one should you adopt? They all do a great job. It's a complete story. It's like a complete breakfast. It's a complete story of everything. And why? So Brandon's got to love Schopenhauer, but just a preference, right? And Chris, the Carnap says whatever you deem to be most practical, right? It's not like there's any answer beyond what Chris just wrote. There's nothing above that. That's Carnap's point in this 1950 paper. That's the final story. Just it does the work. It does the best work of the bunch. Not that you've shopped around. You probably haven't, right? They're total stories of everything. That's what a metaphysics is. And is there any way to bring logic into this? Well, the thing is, if you bring in logic, what are you presupposing? That the world has a logical structure. So one of the reasons why Carnap can't escape metaphysics. One of the reasons, so let me go back to this diagram. One of the reasons why this, remember this? Hold on, let me make my drawing and we'll end on this. This is the dip. And then it dips back up. Why is it dipping back up? Well, one of the reasons is it slowly dawns on people that, you know what? What is Carnap doing last week and this week? Metaphysics. He's doing metaphysics. He's saying the world has a logical form, at least in this 1932 paper. So Brandon says, there's any way to bring logic into this? If you suppose that the world has a logical form, his 1928 book is called The Logical Structure of the World. Well, dude, you doing metaphysics, you're telling everyone that you ought not to do metaphysics, and in so doing, you're doing metaphysics. You can't escape metaphysics. Like imagine I say, here's all these worldviews, here's all these metaphysical statements, metaphysical systems, they're all frameworks. And I say, oh, you know what? there's this big machinery called L, called logic, that we can use to figure out which one to adopt. What am I presupposing? Well, this is what I'm doing. I'm saying this. This is what I've just done. I've just hopped into one circle. I've just hopped into a system, right? And then I'm making a little model of the other systems inside it, but I've already accepted that logic has some sort of priority. How do you resolve the disagreement between Carnap and Heidegger? Carnap says when the going gets tough, you know, and logic and your claims and contradict with logic, ditch the claims. And when Heidegger says when your metaphysical investigations contradict with your logic, ditch your logic. So remember that quote from Heidegger: logic dissolves in the whirl of a more basic questioning. Okay, so how do we do that? So when it conflicts with my logic, I make an investigation, my philosophical results conflict with my logic. Should I ditch logic or should I ditch the results of my philosophical investigation? This is the ultimate metaphysical question. I'm investigating the nature of reality by argumentative and philosophical means. They come in conflict, my results come in conflict with, let's say, logic. And you choose. The direction of fit can totally go the other way around. That just goes to show that logic has limitations. You can say I've come upon a stupidity, or you can say just goes to show logic can't grasp the truth I've just discovered.